Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Menashe. Happy first of the month. On the first day of each month, we review the book of the month on this podcast. In order to be considered for book of the month, a book has to meet a very simple criteria. It has to be impactful enough that it will either change your life or your perspective on the world. Whether it does or not, of course, is entirely up to you. If you consume the content as a piece of entertainment, well, you're kind of missing the point. But if you internalize it, make it part of you, you have a realistic shot at growth. Our book this month was absolutely a mind-bender. It's called Debt, The Last 5,000 Years. I expected this book to be thought-provoking, and it did not disappoint. The author of the book is anthropologist David Graeber, and the book was written in the wake of the great financial crisis of 2008 and published in 2011. For those who went through 2008, and for those who remember it, the great financial crisis was the mother of all deleveraging events observed so far in our modern times. The author of the book is also the organizer of the Occupy Wall Street movement. That captured headlines and attention from around the world. The association with the Occupy Wall Street movement immediately biased me against the book. However, as I went through the book's pages, I found the author's arguments to be well constructed, and many of them were compelling. The entire discussion cannot be had without a deeper understanding what this four-letter word actually means. At the most basic level, when someone borrows $100 with an agreement to repay that $100 with a 1% interest, a year later, most would agree that the entire debt consists of $101. But what happens when an African country is forced to pay money to France for the construction of roads and infrastructure that were built by an invading army? Those roads were never asked for. They were never agreed to. They were built by an invading army connected to an imperialist power, and somehow, decades, in fact more than a century later, that debt seems to grow and never seems to get paid down. The International Monetary Fund, as the global enforcer of these debts, are hard at work renegotiating and increasing the accrued interest on loans that were never really made. There's examples of human slavery dating back thousands of years, where people have paid their so-called debts by sending their daughters to be the repayment. I came to understand the difference between a voluntary agreement and an artificial predatory obligation. Yet somehow, in our simple use of language, the entire spectrum of these arrangements get lumped together and treated with the same legitimacy. This book, to me, presents a stunning reversal of conventional wisdom. The author shows that for more than 5,000 years, since the beginning of the most basic agrarian empires, humans have used elaborate credit systems to buy and sell goods. And that's long before the invention of coins or cash. It's in that early era that we first encounter society divided into creditors and debtors. Graeber shows that the arguments about debt and debt forgiveness have been at the center of political debates for thousands of years, from Italy to China, as well as sparking innumerable insurrections. The entire discussion is far more interesting when you consider that all fiat currencies in our modern world are in fact loaned into existence. Even on the face of a $1 bill, it's written, in plain sight, the very front, it says Federal Reserve Note. It's a loan. Somehow it's socially acceptable. In fact, socially required that people pay their debts. Yet we have a monetary system in which those debts are being eroded through inflation, through the printing of money. The U.S. government just recently has spent months negotiating even the notion that the ceiling of this perpetual loan that we call the national debt to be raised, and by how much and under what circumstances. What happens when officials borrow funds on behalf of the citizenship? Does it make sense that I have the authority to take out a loan on behalf of my neighbor? Most people would argue that such a loan would not be legitimate. Yet there's innumerable examples throughout history, leading all the way up to modern times, of precisely this kind of arrangement. Somehow, these debts become legitimized and enforced. Except, of course, when it's the ones who make the rules who somehow exempt themselves from those rules. We then wonder why there's global conflict over resources. Is China the bad guy for not wanting the monopoly money that we call the U.S. dollar? Or is the U.S. the bad guy for debasing the currency and cheating when it comes to paying its bills? The purest definition of debt has two willing parties engaged in a contract for the lending and repayment of funds. That part's pretty straightforward. But what happens when the obligation is being imposed upon someone who is not a willing participant to the agreement? Is that, in fact, a legitimate debt? This book has caused me to re-examine what I and probably most people took for granted. This book is a hefty read. At about 700 pages, it took a while to get through. But if you truly want to understand something that's at the center of our modern society, go ahead and get a copy of Debt, The Last 5,000 Years. As you think about that, have an awesome rest of your day. Go make some great things happen. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.